So I think what will be exciting is after Jones's perspective, what we'll do it like a debate. Because ICSF will present a contrary opinion to what Jones presented. So we work under the assumption that there are international regulations, rights, frameworks that we engage with in good faith and that were created with the kind of advocacy and the engagement of governments as well as civil society and lots of other organizations, international organizations that try to work for the welfare of fishing communities while also looking at what is the welfare of the resource and sustainability. Yeah, so we'll go into some of these terms. I think Ashwati has sent you all a PDF with some glossary of terminology. Don't bother about it, I don't want to overload you with information, but that's useful. I think many of these terms you guys have already come across over the last few days. So we'll just go over that. If there are any terms that you feel are suddenly like coming out of nowhere, ask me or we'll kind of go over. So a lot of what I'll talk about is connected to the documents that we brought along with us. And these are international documents. Some are reports that present the latest scenario of fisheries. One is an ICSF summary of lots of these instruments and legal frameworks that we're going to talk about. And one is, of course, an instrument, and I'll come to what an instrument means, that was in fact developed for what we call the small-scale fishery sector. It's a dedicated instrument for it. So can someone just like tell me what they think the word instrument means? And just to clarify, it's not a musical instrument, it's none of that. It's when we talk about the legal scenario, an instrument. Close to that. So an instrument is actually in the legal framework what it is a kind of a legal framework. So an instrument can be a binding treaty, which can be either bilateral treaties like we have between countries. India has several with many of our neighbors, with the US, with the UK. It could be multilateral treaties, such as, what we will come to the Biodiversity Convention, or we talk about the Law of the Sea Convention. And then there are other kinds of treaties which involve just multilateral bodies and not governments. Yeah. So, can you go to the next slide? So just to, I think some of this you would have already covered. And we want to get a picture of what global fisheries looks like. So this is quoted from what is official statistics. And of course Jones and others have talked about what are the problems with some of these official statistics. They're very limited, they are flawed, because when you talk about something like fisheries resources, you know that the sea or the marine area is extremely dynamic, is extremely complex, and the exercise of what we call stock assessment, catch data, you might have discussed how the CMFRA works in India, which is our scientific institution for marine resources. So that work of actually calculating what is the stock, but also more importantly what is the catch, is very flawed. It's based on models, but it's the best thing we have. Yeah. In terms of what's conventional science, but as per the understanding of science, it was always supposed to be, as we understand it, a combination of traditional knowledge as well as what we call new advances in knowledge. So, global fish production in 2018, as per this latest report, stands at about 180 million tons. India produces about 13 million tons out there. We are the third largest producer of fish. So, 179 million tons of this, as we've been discussing over the last few days, aquaculture in the last 3 or 4 decades has become a major force in terms of supply of both food for exports but also food for domestic markets. So when you look at, this was the first year actually, it's quite a historic moment. In 2018 is the first time that you see aquaculture surpassing in global fisheries, the production of marine capture and inland capture fish production. In India, it happened a decade or more ago. But in the global scenario, it's the first time that actually aquaculture has outstripped fish production from marine capture and inland capture fish production. And what's very important to remember, and we'll come to why I've stressed on Asia. Asia, if you include China, it's 69% of this fish, both aquaculture and capture fisheries. It accounts for 39%. China alone is actually 34%. It's crazy how much they produce. And the fish exports, so we're talking about 3 levels, right? What fish and fisheries contribute to. One is the economic value of the exports as well as the total value that includes domestic fish consumption as well. We're talking about the contribution to livelihoods and food security. So we know that, and if you go to the next slide, we will come to the idea of how many people are employed in the sector, how important it is for livelihoods, not just of men, women, and people across, from full-time to part-time workers, from informal workers to the formal fishery sector. Like you have factory laws in parts of the world, you have formalized fisheries management systems, which, if I'm not mistaken, Siddharth and others would have gone over at some point in the beginning. So one terminology that you might see either in the glossary that I've sent or you might have talked about it is the concept of MSY, maximum sustainable yield. Now that is calculated and the simple definition of it is that the resource, how much it can regenerate despite what you take out from it. So there are certain concepts such as reference points in the fishery. So in this context, we're talking about only capture fisheries. Aquaculture, the concept of MSY doesn't come right now. But maximum sustainable yield, as you hear in the environmental discussion these days, whether it's the green organizations, WWF or Greenpeace, or you see in the SDGs, this is a constant statistic that you'll keep seeing, which is that from the 1970s, when you had 90% of fish stocks. Now, stock calculation is another, like I said, CMFRI, like in the West, you have other institutions that do this. They give the data to FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, and that FAO does a kind of larger analysis to calculate what is the sustainability of the stocks. So that has declined dramatically from 90% of maximally sustainably fished stocks in the 1970s. It has gone down to 59.6%. At the same time, what was unsustainably fished in the 70s, which is 10%, has gone up to 34%. Now this can present to you like it can be presented how the Greens presented, which is very alarmist, right? It could be that, oh my God, that fish is just disappearing from the sea. But at the same time, that's not true. As we see, fishing communities are thriving and living despite all the problems that they face, which Jones and others have spoken about. So what's important to remember is that there's lots of regional variations between these statistics that you see. So not all fish stocks around the world are unsustainably fished. You see that the places in the developed world, what we call the global north, such as Atlantic or some parts of the Pacific around the US, Canada, Europe, Norway, Iceland, those are extremely overfished fisheries. In India, Asia, and those parts, you see that there are some species that are in fact underfished, some species that are overfished, and we'll come to that. So, as has been explained abundantly in the last few days, fisheries is not just a resource, it's not just the economic value of it or that what you catch and you consume. It is this very, very important sector for people around the world. So, this is just highly underestimated statistics, right? Because we don't have in many parts of the world, such as India or Asia, you don't have data that's reported, especially inland sector, which actually employs more people than the marine sector. You see that if you total, it's about 250 million people, a rough estimate, a low estimate, that are employed or engaged in the sector. So when you say that about 40 million people are engaged in capture fishing, as we understand it, the value chain, do people know what a value chain of fish is? They must discuss. So pre-harvest, post-harvest, and harvest in between, that whole thing is the value chain, and not just the fish. So if you take one person employed in fishing, you have about 3 people as the rough estimate in the pre and post-harvest sectors. Actually, it's much more than that in small scale and other fisheries that are informal fisheries. So again, Asia, if you see, in the fishing vessels alone, now we're only talking about the fishermen and sometimes women, is the largest in terms of the contribution to the fishing fleet, and at the same time, 97%, nearly all fishing vessels are motorized and non-motorized vessels under 12 meters. So the canoes you might have seen today, I'm sorry I wasn't there with you guys, but that is actually what we call the majority of fishing fleets around the world. In that kind of, they vary across. There are hundreds of variation and combinations between craft and gear. Gear means the nets that you use, and the types of fishing, the species, all of that. So it's such a complex sector. But at the same time, what you'll notice in the subsequent slides is that while the most numbers are the motorized sector, it is in fact the mechanized sector, as you saw, the big vessels today. And if you look at the international definition of what industrial fisheries is, all of Indian fishing boats will be considered small scale. Though these definitions should be applied locally. So for us, that is large scale, but actually under 24 meters is what we call small scale. So all of the vessels you see in India, most of them, will be small scale fishing vessels as per the international definition. When we specifically talk about fishing communities in India, Asia, Africa, Latin America, many parts of Latin America.
What records or whose records do you use to get these numbers?
So you saw the book that I wrote, that's the FAO. The reason we go with this is because this is governments reporting to that. Now governments have their own reasons for overinflating numbers or even under showing the numbers. So China, for example, is famous for sometimes overinflating because the Chinese Communist Party wants to, the fishing officials want to show to the Communist Party that we're doing an amazing job. Actually there's not that many fish. On the other hand, if you see the WTO negotiations, there are lots of the World Trade Organizations, fishery subsidies negotiations. You will see a lot of very complex reporting of how many fishing vessels are there. What are the subsidies being given, because we want to not really tell the world that there are these many fishing vessels. So these are kind of complex things. They're not all black and white like I'm telling you right now. My flow just kind of went. So what I want to kind of point out, so the governments are reporting to the FAO, and the FAO's scientists as well as other officials kind of come to based on the best possible estimate that they have in some kind of concept.
But this is again going to be something that is being adopted to global law, right? So isn't it supposed to be, site specific, when we are going to collect data like this?
Yeah.
Because, India itself being so diverse along the whole coast, wouldn't the data differ? Each state's data, and also comparing it to the methods that have been set throughout the globe wise.
No, are you talking about fishing craft data or some other kind of?
Fishing craft data as well as the catch data.
Catch data is very complex, but craft data actually shouldn't be so difficult. If we had a proper fisheries management system, which in its true spirit should be participatory, it should have community participation, it should have NGOs, CSOs, everyone working together. You would have a system and also good funding. Like, why is it that people have been asking for a fisheries ministry here? It's because with the minimal funding that we get, which is I think roughly about 1,000 crores is the ministry's funding, fisheries ministry. You can barely, you're basically using a lot of this for this century sponsored schemes for the fees and subsidies. And the ministry's expenses, because they have one secretary, you have two joint secretaries, and you have a few scientists and a few assistant secretaries and additional secretaries. That's really not enough for a country like India, which is in terms of production the third largest producer, in terms of the number of fish workers that exist. We just come to that. It's a gigantic number. Can we go to the next slide? Sorry, I'm slowing down. Yeah. So before we go into this, you might have noticed that in the previous round we talked about Asia, Africa, Latin America, but particularly Asia. Now there's a reason why the fishery statistics in terms of production and number of vessels looks the way it is today. If you go to the 1940s or 50s or even earlier, you would have next to like a fraction of the fishing vessels and the fisheries contribution in terms of production that Asia, Africa and all contributed to. And there are historical reasons for that. I think Jones touched upon it, I'm sure your previous speakers did as well, the Indo-Norwegian project. So what happens is that after the war, the Second World War, the India as well as the African and the Asian countries start to get independence, and then in the post-colonial spirit of that time, you have wider and wider demands for the sovereignty of the territorial space that you occupy. So for India, for example, land the British left. But what was happening was that if India, you look at Asia, Africa, from time immemorial, the developed fishing countries had their fishing fleets coming, like all the things that were discussed, the LOP scheme or the other issues, come much later. So because of the mare liberum idea, which is the freedom of the seas idea, which was there from there, comes from the 1600s, the age of exploration and things like that. Right? So that idea was that as a nation, the nation state itself is a new idea, but let's use the word nation. You have about sovereignty 3 nautical miles from your coast. It used to be even less than that, because how it was calculated was if the cannon can fire, what is the distance that it goes to? So your fortresses and stuff would hit the ships that were invading. So that was the understanding of the national jurisdiction over your marine area. But what happens is that from the 1940s, 50s onwards, and led by not just India, but especially the Latin American countries, Brazil, Chile, others, they start to demand that we want the 200 nautical mile zone as the, so they first asked for 12 nautical miles, and then they said 200 nautical miles, we want that as our territory. Because till then what you had is, if you see Spain, the Basque fishers, Spanish fishers, the French, the Chinese, the Soviets, the Chinese of course came much later, but the Soviets, so mainly the European fisheries were dominating. So they would go to the West African coast, which is known to have this upwelling current, which gives you plentiful resources, especially in like mackerel and other species, pelagic species. They were just sweeping up the seas, and nothing was coming to the national governments in terms of that. So what you do is, from the 50s onwards, you start to have these law of the sea conventions. So there were 3 conventions in all, the meetings in all, 3 conferences. Sorry, I used the word conventions. It's law of the seas conferences. The convention hadn't come yet. So first 2 kind of failed, because the US, especially at that time, the Cold War was going on, they wanted to say that we don't want anybody to tell us where our warships can go and things like that. So there are all kinds of reasons for that. So those failed, and finally what you see is real extensive negotiations, and you'll see some of the really heroic figures of the Indian foreign service and people like that going in kind of fighting for the rights of the coastal religious societies there. And what we get in the process in 1982 is the Law of the Sea Convention, which actually is called the Constitution of the Sea, of the Oceans. So there's actually a map later, but I think Siddharth and others told you about this, the 200 nautical mile zone, why it's called the EEZ, and the 12 nautical mile zone, why it's called the territorial waters. And you know the concept of baselines? No? So as per the
baseline was not discussed.
Could you also touch upon why?
What is that?
Could you also touch upon why? Why is it called?
Why is it called that? Yeah. So what happens is that there's also not just a fishery resource there. You have also the interest, and this is where some of the more darker forces of industrialization come in. So this kind of rush for the oil, for example. Today 60% of oil is produced actually from the seas. It's sucked out of the ocean, not really from the land. Back then itself, the big strides in oil production had happened. Then there was all the talk of manganese nodules. We're going to have a gold rush. We don't need to rely on mining in the forests, or you guys don't need to be moved and stuff like that. Just, it's bullshit. But because of this rush, even the post-colonial societies were actually saying that, oh man, this is actually a great opportunity for us to cash in on our promised loot in that sense. But also from an equity perspective, it's important, because why should, if we are operating in the nation state kind of framework, why should India relinquish its resources to a foreign power? So back then it was just fisheries, but there was all this promise of underwater cables, there was mining, there was oil, there was other kinds of, if you see today the blue economy discussions also talk about things like marine genetic resources, which would be very precious for producing drugs and things. So one thing to remember is that as much as we talk about the Tamil slogan of the Kadal being ours and we are the children of the sea, which is really the notion of traditional rights or customary rights is very important. Coastal communities deserve it; it is their right. In the same way that the forest communities, as the First Nations or indigenous people, which India doesn't recognize, it is a very important idea for them. But at the same time, there have historically been users of the marine space. So if you see from the Roman era, India used to be the richest country because we used to send a lot of the goods that we produce to every part of the world, from the east and the west. So shipping, for example, has been a traditional resource user. It's a different thing that today what we call shipping is not what the older idea of the sailboats and a much more romantic, nostalgic idea of the sailing.
We know why, like, when they said 100 nautical miles, like, what were those numbers based on?
Precise number, I'm not sure. I think it came out of negotiations because the various countries were trying to kind of claim as much as possible. So in fact, even today there are some countries in Latin America now that claim that our exclusive economic zone is actually 350 nautical miles. So I think that it came through negotiations trying to whittle down as much as possible, still maintaining the notion of the heritage of mankind as the oceans are called. So if you read the UNCLOS, it has several hundred articles. It's this fat book. And in those, at the very beginning, it says that the ocean is the common heritage of mankind. But there are certain rights and duties that states have over these resources that they can fall under national jurisdiction. So when you look at the territorial waters, so the baseline, sorry to come back to the idea of the baseline, how you draw it is, usually the baseline is the low tide line. So there's a low tide line and the high tide line. Right? So many countries, if they don't want to go through the process of drawing these baselines. So what the baseline is, so this is the coast, this is the low tide line, this would be the baseline. This is called the seaward side. So in India, I'm talking about the east coast. If you're sitting in Chennai or any part of Tamil Nadu, east coast, this would be the seaward side of the baseline. And if this is the baseline, this is called the landward side. Now, your rights differ according to which side you're on. So, because India, many other countries have indented coasts, right? Why is it that Gujarat, for example, they're able to do whatever the hell they want in the Gulf of Kutch or the Gulf of Kambal? Because that falls on the landward side of the baseline, which means that you have this area in the Gulfs becomes the internal waters of the state. So it's very important. So if you actually calculate how much of internal waters India now would have, it's thousands of square kilometers. And that actually they have what is called, so the internal waters and the territorial sea, which is on this side, 12 nautical miles on this side, you have what's called sovereignty for the sea, which means that not only can you do whatever you want in the water column, so this is the seabed, this is the water column, this is the surface of the water. So the seabed, you have absolute sovereignty. This area, the water column, whatever marine living resources that you call, you have absolute sovereignty. But with certain riders, which is that you need to follow the duties of sustainable management of those oceans. But whereas after 12 nautical miles, up to 200 nautical miles, so it's not that you start at 12 and count another 200 and make it 212. 200 is part of it. So up to 200 nautical miles, you have what's called sovereign rights, which is that you have absolute sovereignty over the seabed, which means that no one can come and take your oil or the manganese nodules unless you have a bilateral agreement with, let's say, advanced country like he was talking about Norway and things like that, which till now hasn't been signed because as per my understanding, the scientists in MOES and all say that we're still 15 years away from actually developing technology to get these nodules, but that's a different question. So you have sovereignty of the seabed, and you have the rights to catch all the fish you want in the water column, but with the riders of sustainable management. So if you see Articles 61 and 62 of the conventional law of the sea convention, those deal with how you conserve marine living resources. So that's in fact the first time in the so-called constitution of the ocean that you have a framework being set for how you manage your fishing. Because up till then it was just a free-for-all. You know, other than these small UN meetings and guidelines and all this that used to happen. So, but what other states have a right to do, like US is concerned on this, is that you have the right of safe passage or innocent passage. The right of innocent passage is that if you are a merchant ship with a flag of, let's say, flying Panama or the US or any part, you can go through that coast, through those waters of the EEZ, and you don't even have to inform the Coast Guard or the Navy or whatever. But the moment you enter the territorial sea, actually then the Coast Guard and others try to comes in. But that is safe passage, so which means that you can't just take a warship through the waters. But US and all have continued to do that because of their money. As we call the constitution, whether it's the Indian constitution or the legal framework, most often it is kind of followed in the breach and not really in the true spirit of its implementation. So, when we talk about sustainability, it's important to keep in mind, I'll go to the Law of the Sea Convention, but where do these words like sustainable use, sustainable development come from? So the very first convention where you see, which is the Ramsar Convention, so India has several Ramsar sites, you have the idea of wise use. They didn't use the word sustainable back in the 70s. Till you come to the Stockholm Conference, which was, by the way, Indira Gandhi went and made a huge impression there. She comes back, and that's when you get things like the Maritime Zones of India Act, or you have the Wildlife Protection Act, Protection Act. So the Stockholm Conference is where you come with the idea of sustainable development. And the definition of sustainable development, it varies, but the broad understanding is that the resources that you enjoy in the current generation should be also enjoyable to the future generation. So there is a kind of this idea of intergenerational equity, and which is why Greta Thunberg or all of you young activists are talking about how our parents school loosely, what it means is that despite not having perfect scientific data, you're going to try your utmost to sustainably manage the resources. So that's not just fisheries it comes later, but all resources on land. Which is why your question about imperfect information. So precautionary approach, what it really is telling us is that you're supposed to, India doesn't have the best fisheries management system, we will never have the budgets for MCS, as he pointed out, the monitoring, control, and surveillance. One surveillance boat, if you see what, even a country like Korea, it costs about $40 million a year. So let's just like dream on whatever getting MCS vessels and things like that. One day, if they try to have satellite transponders and stuff on board fisheries.
Was it precautionary approach was also for, something like lowland areas and
what is that?
I'm saying precautionary approach applies to everything.
It applies to everything, not just lowland. If you remember what it is that you're referring to, just send it to us. We can just discuss that. It came up because the Rio conference is about all types.
After the Rio, the summit came.
It has a
So only Environment Protection Act 1984
Yashoka, if I'm getting anything wrong, point it out.
because precautionary, polluted waste and sustainable development are three terms of the
Rio.
that's what it is.
Yeah. So in between, actually, as Yashoka said, there are multiple conventions that come. There is, because if you see Japan in the 1950s, they had those crazy Minamata leak and all these kind of problems. So you have all these conventions for oil spills, you have for industrial pollutants, various kinds of conventions. But we're not going to go into each of those. But for example, India played a big role in the 1992 one. As I said, Indira Gandhi was there in Stockholm plenary. And finally, out of the United Nations Environment meeting in Rio comes some of the most important environmental things, which is the Convention on Biological Diversity, 1992, and you have the UNFCCC, which is the climate change convention. Right, so climate change actually, if you see back then, the discussion had almost no talk of fisheries. But now, if you see, there's all these new reports like the IPCC Cryosphere report on 1.5 degrees that shows that like fisheries is going to be badly affected. But they also, like as Joan said, many scientists will also look at it as an opportunity. So temperate zones, because of the fish coming up from the warmer waters, will gain in the fisheries. But obviously, that's not what we should be looking forward to.
So, were any of these, like at any of these, were they specifically talking about fisheries when they talked about sustainable management? Or
I'll come to that. The fisheries specific instruments I'll come to. This, as I said, was the first time that you see, of course it comes after the United Nations Law of the Sea, but the Law of the Sea's main focus is not really fisheries. It's about the rights to that entire ocean. Right? So this is the first.
Any fishing rights has been mentioned in Law of Seas?
Yes, I'll just tell you. Not in law of the sea. The first time you see it is after the law of the sea in the fish stocks agreement.
No, not
But
in the law of the sea.
I'll just talk about what it is it says in the law.
But the other thing is that whether US signed, still now they are not signing that. US ratified UNCLOS.
US has. But US is one of those real outliers because if you go to the previous slide, the Biological Diversity Convention, they're the only ones who didn't sign that.
UNCLOS also they didn't sign.
Most highly ratified, 196 parties exist to that. A party is anyone who has signed or ratified or what the word is acceded to an international law.
So he has freedom of seas. He has freedom of
They
seas.
still actually don't. So if you see the US sits in on all the meetings of CBD, they sit in the UNCLOS things. But what happens is that obviously the Cold War dynamics, so Soviet Russia used to do the same thing. US would do it, and now China to some extent is shown as the big villain because all of those issues in the South China Sea and all that. So the UNCLOS, as we said, is the constitution of the ocean, and specifically Articles 61 and 62 are the ones that, if you, all of this is online, yeah, it's all in the public domain, is what talks about fisheries management. Now it goes into a lot of detail. If you just want a summary of it, you can see it in this publication of ICSF and in many other explainers. And then they talk about concepts of total allowable catch, which was a term that was used in the Western fisheries management frameworks for many years, but it really was formalized in the United Nations Convention on the Sea. They talk about registering fishing vessels, about gears, that is the fishing nets, about fish species, and about the ideas of rice use, sustainable use, and many other measures. Now what happens is, as we said, in that period of what we talked about, the post-colonial changes in the fisheries around the world, with on one hand the loss of access for the big European and US fisheries, Soviet fisheries, after the arrival of the Law of the Sea Convention. They didn't lose access, but they would now have to, like if they want to come to India, they would have to sign an agreement, the bilateral agreement. So what the United Convention Law of the Sea says is that the coastal state, now there are few ideas you should understand: coastal state, port state, market state. These ideas you should. We'll come to them. Yeah, but these are terminologies that are quite important. So the coastal state, if they are not, they have sovereignty over the fishery resources. What in UNCLOS is called the marine living resources. But if you are not exhausted the resource as per the current knowledge that you have, if your fishery is still a very small scale fishery, if you still have a large chunk of resources, then you can consider with bilateral agreements to give your fishery resource access to some other countries. Which is how since the 1980s you have Europe signing multiple fisheries access agreements with Senegal, with Ghana, with all of these countries, which now China is kind of coming because they are the biggest fisheries. So because of that reorganization of fisheries, what you see is from the 1950s where you have you saw that early statistic which I showed, which is 180 million million metric tons of fish production, out of which the majority is being caught by the Asian countries. That was exactly the reverse. It was the Europe and the US and the Canadians and the Norwegians and the Icelandic who were catching most of that fish. But then you suddenly see a change, not just because of the reorganization of the laws and the resources, but also, as we said, the Indo-Norwegian project, like that they had multiple technology transfer projects, development aid, things that come, which caused their own problems, but what they also did was allow developing countries to raise their fish production, and we can all talk about and argue about what it is that the damaging effects of that were. But it allowed these countries to aid the livelihoods of millions more. So the fish stocks agreement comes out of that because what you start to notice is that the resource starts to get depleted. So you had these major crises in the 80s and 90s. You might talk about the whaling conflicts of that time. You know, like there was whales being caught indiscriminately. There were other fish stocks being depleted. Many iconic species such as sharks and rays and turtles and all of these things getting caught in nets. And what you notice is if you see these statistics of FAO, they have it all the way back in the 1950s. at some point in the 80s it starts to plateau. And the growth rate, from an alarmingly high growth rate, it starts to kind of slow. It's still been growing, but it's like 1%, 2%, 3% increase in reaction. And it's in reaction to that, as you had the reaction around the world to the Amazon being chopped or whatever, that you have the global fisheries instruments, regulation instruments, which is, first is the United Nations Fish Stocks Agreement.
But even though there was regional seas
Action plans. But that's just an action plan, it's not a, so what the difference has
just
been?
before
Yeah.
that's
The reason why we're talking about legal instruments is there are some that are called soft instruments, some that are called hard or binding instruments. So things like the Fish Stocks Agreement clause, once you ratify it or once you sign it, you have certain responsibilities. Whereas we'll come to issues like the multiple regional plans of action on sharks or marine fishing, but almost never implemented.
So these are going to be the multilateral agreements.
These are actual multilateral binding agreements. So the code of conduct is actually a code, like the regional plan action. It's like what we call the directive principles of state policy. That is not really like the fundamental rights which can be enforced in law. So the code is what is best practices. Yeah. And the best practices, what happens with this is now it's 20, I think the world was celebrating 25 years of the code, which means that even 25 years later we're still talking about how to implement it.
But this is only if the country has signed the signatory or if the country has been a signatory of...
No, as I said, this is a code. This is not a thing to sign. You can endorse it. But endorsing is not the same as signing, ratifying. Because what happens is, when you ratify it, like the UNCLOS or the CBD, India, for example, ratified the CBD in 1994. Yeah, the CBD came in CBD, I mean Convention on Biological Diversity. But and then we had to create a law within a certain period in order to implement that biological diversity ratification. Yeah. So what if you see Article, I think 243 of the Indian Constitution deals with the responsibility is in the Parliament, the Union. It's in the Union government's ballpark. The Parliament can, if it has ratified a particular international treaty, and create the laws in your constitution to implement it at a national level. Now, as we know, with a lot of laws, including the Forest Rights Act or the Environmental Protection Act, they're obviously not completely implemented. In fact, very less so. But it's very important to remember that there is a framework that we need to use when we talk about any of these kind of discussions, whether it's the fisheries or it's the human rights or it's the environmental protection discourse. So, so this is kind of a combination of binding instruments, these two. This especially is the most powerful instrument. And then this one is a code, it's not binding, it's a kind of best practices. And finally you have the Port State Measures Agreement, which is actually, I put it there, but I feel like we'll be going into a really bigger discussion because in India we don't need to worry about the port state because we don't have foreign vessels coming and landing fish in our harbors. This is for countries which have, let's say, fisheries access agreements with a foreign nation, which is a big fishing nation. They're going and fishing in your waters and to prevent what's called IUU fishing. You know what IUU fishing is? No? So it's a terminology that again came in the 90s and in the 2000s, which is illegal, unregulated and unreported fisheries. Now this is a term that often now is used to hit countries like India and other developing countries on the head, saying that just because you have a small scale fishery, which often goes catches unreported and you don't have the proper regulation in place sometimes, that you're necessarily in that category. So these are very different things. Illegal is you're actually breaching the law and that's actually. Whereas unreported and unregulated are not desirable. It would be good to have regulations so that everyone can collectively conserve the resources and prevent collapse. Action. So that's what if you are a signatory to any of these agreements that deal with port state measure, you should have the kind of legislation in your country which deals with that violation. the enforcement is a very complex thing. We have to talk about that. We'll come to that in the Indian context. I'll just tell you the legal frame. So, for example, the law of the sea convention, what you do is if you have a conflict between two countries like India and Bangladesh fighting about the Bay of Bengal, about what is yours and what is mine in the ocean space. So Bangladesh took India to the tribunal, which is so under the UNCLOS you have this tribunal that is set up to look into conflicts or disputes of this kind. It's a long process where international lawyers will sit and discuss, and then at some point, based on historical claims to that water, that oceanic area, and other factors, they will rule. So India actually lost a small, not small, it's huge, but compared relatively to its EZ, it's not a very big area to Bangladesh. So similarly, you have huge conflicts between India and Sri Lanka, for example, is one of those areas where it's the only example of its kind, where
பந்திக்கு அறுக்கிறது கிடையாது பந்திக்கு அறுக்கிறது கிடையாது ஆனால் நான் எனக்கு இருக்குன்னு சொல்கிறேன்
bilateral understanding, but the fishing communities keep getting hit. There's always conflict between fishing and fishing.
Manas, for clarity, little confusing that we are all small scale fishes. As per legally, we are all small scale vessels. No,
see, according to the international definition, each country for its fisheries management is supposed to regulate and create a definition of what is small scale. So actually, in our Indian context, we are not all small scale. The majority are small scale, but the majority of the catch, as you also pointed out, is coming from the mechanized sector, and the mechanized sector should not be called small scale. So there is a very kind of difficult debate in countries like India because they're understanding its owner-operator vessel, which is that I am a fisherman and I am also taking my mechanized vessel to go. It's not like in some of the industrial countries where you have businesses owning 80 trawlers and super trawlers and stuff.
Yeah, you are right. Let it be like that. But IUU fishing is applicable to the port measure agreement and other things.
Yeah.
How does then our policies, acts, everything is taking IUU fishing into it? Because I am not eligible for it.
No, see, preventing, deterring and eliminating IUU fishing by preventing vessels from coming to port is one of the aspects of this law. It's not the only law that deals with IUU fishing. So if you see code of conduct refers to IUU fishing. UN Fish Stocks Agreement, I need to check this, but I'm not sure if it refers to it, but there are several like this. I'm just talking about the big ticket, instruments, legal instruments. In between there's all the FAO. What happens is that they sit and discuss every 2 years.
So IUU term came much before 2009.
Yeah, before 2009.
When which convention it started? Whether in law of seas or after that? 1995.
It's not in law of the seas. It's somewhere around this time.
Okay.
And it's not actually part of any legal definition, which is because it's so complex to define. Each country would have its own idea of what is illegal, what is unregulated, what is unregulated. So you have to. It's kind of a advisory principle that you have in terms of IUU fishing. But in India, what would be called IUU fishing is illegal fishing, not UU. Illegal fishing would be as per we have the Marine Fishing Regulation Acts. Most of these acts have minimum mesh size. They have no use of dynamite, no use of poison. For example, in the old 1897.
Old days.
So if you actually are seen to use dynamite or something, you could actually be fined. So in the rules of these laws, as you know, they have what is the fine and things like that. But in India, obviously it's a welfare oriented fisheries department we have to some extent, so they don't want to act like a policeman with the fishermen. So what you see often for these kind of abuses, use of illegal fishing and all is a very small fine, which for the large vessels and all is actually not a big fine.
The other one is that these laws are there and everything. If a country makes an agreement, like now Kerala government is going to make an agreement with the US, which has been come down, with the deep sea fishing and other things, big deep sea vessels, prototype vessels.
But that was defeated by Jackson, it's gone.
It is gone, see, let it go, the other thing. But how does these agreements work, mutual agreements? I am making agreement in my own sea. I can, then they have the freedom of sea, they can come and do fishing, whether it will be applicable for them. Because if it is a foreign vessel, it won't be applicable, as per the law. foreign vessel cannot come and fish in EEZ.
Because of the protests of NFF and all.
No, neither.
There is no,
I'm
there is
saying
no foreign vessel in India.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
But if a foreign country, if an American
Legally there's no. Yeah.
American company
Yeah.
signs an agreement with me,
Yeah.
and if he fishes in the EEZ,
Yeah.
whether it is applicable? Trade agreement between both.
Yeah, as per the law, like I said, as per the intro.
This law will not prevent
Which law?
this law.
No, because if see the agreement, if it is between India and US and the US promises to fish sustainably, it would be allowed. But the point is, will the Indian government, you see these kind of stupid decisions, but it wasn't what the meaning of the deep sea fishing policy, of course I'm not talking about the LOP scheme or the other ones. In the new draft policy, what they're saying is they want to get investment.
Yeah.
But they want Indian fishing communities to own the boats and to go fish.
Yeah.
Which, as you said, it is ridiculous. Because to own those boats, you need huge investment. But we don't need to worry about the US. There are big Indian businessmen who want to invest in these vessels. One thing that you need to keep in mind, Spartacus, is that about 97% of Indian fish stocks is within the 0 to 100 meter depth.
Okay.
As I think Vivek has pointed out in this meeting. It is only the small, about 67 to 100,000 tons of fish that exists in the oceanic water.
12 to 200.
Not 12 to 200, I'm talking about 200 meter depth. That could vary. So in Gujarat, for example, the shelf is really big. You have to travel 100 kilometers to finally go out of the shelf and go to deep sea. Whereas in the Bay of Bengal, you have a shelf that is very narrow. You just have to go about 40 kilometers or something to go and to deep waters. But I'm saying that if you see the way that the biology of the waters work, you don't have in tropical waters such as India fish resources beyond a certain distance, which is why all of these dreams that India has is actually it's not sustainable, because what will happen is you're going to get these guys to do deep sea fishing and you're going to give them, let's say, longliners for tuna. There is only 200,000 tons of tuna in the Indian Ocean waters. So unless you go and argue for your rights in the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission, which means that you can go, I'm sorry, this is kind of going all over the place, but just to answer this question. Unless India is part of the Indian Ocean. Yeah, but India is not a historical tuna fishery. Though we know that Chennai, Kerala, Trivandrum, Andhra Pradesh have been traditionally tuna fishers, but they have not been going into.
Sorry, they were not traditional fishers. It began only from 1994.
I'm not talking about the modern fishing. If you go to even Sangam literature, there is discussion about, like, you could go, what is Old Man in the Sea, the Hemingway story, or if you see people catching shark, tuna, near shore.
This is the question, not deep sea.
Deep sea, no. India has actually never been a historical high seas fishery except for the Tutur guys.
Correct.
If you see, Tutur is a district, an area of 8 villages in Venugopal district, and they are experts in tuna fishing. They are long lines. So there is about 1,000 of these boats who over time have been built, who have kind of slowly developed from just handline fishery using small motorized boats, and now they have about 15 to 18 meter length vessels that go. They've been taught by the British authorities in the island of Diego Garcia, which is like, it's this tiny little island deep in the Indian Ocean, which is not an Indian territory, it's outside, it's a British territory. So these guys are some of the bravest, most exciting fishers, one of the most skilled fishers. And they're also, longlining can be a sustainable fishery also, because they're not very big and they don't have thousands of lines. I'm sorry to overload you with information, but like this is because it was a question. The reason why we talked about the Indian Ocean Tuna Commission is because the UN Fish Stocks Agreement stipulates that what it is actually only dealing with is the straddling and highly migratory fish stocks. Does anyone can they guess what straddling and highly migratory fish stocks could mean? Yeah, so straddle, you can straddle, like you can straddle the chair and the table together, that's straddling. So straddling is fish stocks that can move between the exclusive economic zones of two countries, often the exclusive economic zone of one country into the high seas, and then come back into some. So tuna is that kind of a fish. Tuna is one of the most precious fish resources because you have this very, very high value sashimi and other other markets in Japan and other places like the US. So it's like a gold of the fish. Right?
Wait, any fish, any that migrate?
Whales migrate, but whales are mammals. But whales also, the fishing for whales was not really for the flesh. It used to be in the time before petroleum where they needed to use fish for candles, oil, other kind of industrial things. So they wanted to use their black holes and stuff. So it was a terrible fishery. It was not contributing at all to food. Whereas tuna, though it is a high value species, you also have tuna that is caught in close to the shore, like if you go to Trivandrum, what we call shura. Trivandrum, it's like people swear by that fish. It's like how mackerel is important in Goa, or Ayla is actually important here, but tuna is a very important fish. And you have multiple types of tuna. So the UN Fish Stocks Agreement, what it mainly deals with, because as I told you, the international bodies don't really, they cannot step on your toes if you're an Indian body. So what you have within your EEZ, you have a duty to protect that resource to sustainable fishing. But when it comes to fish stocks that are moving between your EEZ and going to someone else's, and they find that a precious resource, for them, this kind of UN Fish Stocks Agreement stipulates that you have regional commissions. Because usually, historically, what has happened is that in the Pacific, you will have a certain kind of tuna that is fish and certain historical fisheries that fish for tuna. Similarly, in the Indian Ocean, you get certain kinds. So there's been Maldives, Sri Lanka, other countries, but also Western countries that have historically fished. So what the regional fisheries bodies, he was asking about deep sea, what they are dealing with is the conservation of a resource regionally as a group you do it, which means that you have a responsibility if you are a signatory to this and you join the IOTC. Like India, for example, like every 2 years or every year they go for these IOTC, Indian Ocean Tuna Commission meetings, and say that this is what we're doing for conservation. Now, again, I'm not going to say that this is practiced entirely well or anything like that, but you have a regulatory framework. Yeah. Sorry. How late up? I just want to kind of get out of the concepts and come to what we've been talking about. So what he said was that what you have with the 1970s, 80s, all of these fisheries technology transfer as well as the fisheries development policies is that you have empowered a certain part of the fishing community, most often the more powerful and rich people who can afford a lot of these fishing vessels as part of the Indo-Norwegian project or other bilateral projects were mainly subsidized. So your craft means a fishing vessel, craft, your gear, nets, your diesel, everything was first like almost free. So very low investment, but still the people who could invest were the slightly more powerful ones. So what it leads to is a vast kind of inequality between the sectors. So on one hand you have this historical community that has always gone with a much slower progression in technology, leaps in technology, or very indigenous, traditional modes of changing their technology. You suddenly have Western kind of mechanized vessels, the kind of trawling technology, training, all of that. And what happens is that around the world, around the same time, that in Asia, in Latin America, and in Africa to some extent, you have these people's movements that create fish workers. So I don't know if you met Olencio wasn't there. So Olencio might have talked, or you guys might have heard about Makani Sultana. He was MLA in the Goa government, but he's minister. Sorry, he was a minister. Son of the soil, right?
Yeah. One of the.
He was the first one.
Matali? Yeah. No. Matali was second secretary. But then Mustafa Singh was the first.
guys see some of it.
Okay, I think we should just need to like give like couple of lines about Matari Sadan because not everybody knows and maybe we didn't talk about it.
I was just going to do it. So what happens is that you have the fisheries protests starting from the small scale fishing community represented by, there was for example Thomas Kocheri, who was a priest in Kerala. You have him connecting with some of the fish workers in Vijay, what were the stalwarts in the early days? Venugopal in Maharashtra? Yeah, so Maharashtra
started the movement in Maharashtra.
Yeah.
Venugopal was the first one to initiate. Rambao kind of came in as but Rambao was the one who aligned to NF.
Well, there are two experts on this stage here. One, of course, a participant. We also later. So I won't go too deep into it. So these figures will be discussed at some point. Very exciting history. So you have the National Fish Worker Forum being formed in the late 70s as a result of this protest plan that's starting. At the same time that you have geo conflicts, which means that craft and geo conflicts happen in Asia, which is Southeast Asia, and you also have it in Latin America. So what's happening is that the kind of rampant production increase is leading to inequalities. The concern here at the moment in the 1970s wasn't the traditional pressure, it's that we are not getting anything from the small scale sector because the large scale was coming up to the near shore areas and sweeping up all the fish. So you have the protest movement starting, some of these really great leaders, and then you have support from other civil society organizations, which was also at the same time that the organization that I belong to was also talking civil society members as well as fish worker organizations. Some of the people who hopefully, Nalini was one of the founders, she was at this meeting. This was in 1984. So you have even the Indian fish workers actually represented the National Fish Worker Forum. It was completely, this is before the terminology of crowdfunding and all came. It was just people giving voluntary donations, few thousand euros, few lakh rupees, and finally you have people landing up in 1984 in Rome, and they had a parallel conference saying that the FAO should do better and they should be recognizing small scale fisheries. And there's a charter of demands on which you'll find, I will send it to you, which actually covers a lot of the issues of equity, of sustainability, of human rights, development of fishing communities without just thinking about the resources and economic resources. Women, the important contribution of women to the sector, all of this is being discussed. And then a decade later, so ICSF 1984 was the first conference. There was no such thing as ICSF, but ICSF, the organization, formed a few years later, which is not relevant actually. But the reason I brought it up is because then you have, this is the guy you saw in the book, this is Thomas Kocheri. You have the 1997 conference, which is mainly led by the Indian fish workers and the Canadian fish workers, and to some extent some Latin American fish workers, who form what is called the WFF. It is called. You might have heard about WFFP now, which NFF for Vishu and others represent, Delishis represent, and all is part of this global body. What they did was they came together. This was actually fishing community people, either they're leaders or fishermen themselves, coming in 97 with the small funds that they have. They come and they make this conference a reality, and they form the first fish worker organization at a global level called the WFF. There's a whole history which they will go into later about it splitting, but they're sister organizations. There are two organizations with very similar names, WFF and WFFB, and they're actually part of the same old great history of fishing communities. Traditional fishers. So what we call traditional Canada though doesn't look like our traditional fishers, but they're still traditional. They're mostly old coastal communities for generations. They've been fishing, they're indigenous people. Canada is one of the most important entities. So they come together, they form this in 2002, they have a split, but that's all a different story. Yeah? So this is, by the way, through the 1984 conference, and then the declaration of this 1997 meeting, then the terminology of small-scale fisheries and artisanal fisheries comes into the global debate. This wasn't a word that just magically came. It was because of the work of leaders such as this and civil society people and academics who were big supporters of fishing. And through that history, you have 1970s struggles of fishing communities, you have the slow movement towards recognition of rights of fishing communities, which is why you were asking what are the references to fishing community rights. So this is, in UNCLOS, this is the only real reference you see, because it is mainly a process led by the governments. Right? So the governments have absolute power in something like the law of sea convention. But here you say that when you are looking at environmental and economic factors for fisheries resources, the economic needs of fishing communities and the special requirements of developing states should be taken into consideration when you are thinking about management, conservation. And similarly, that gets moved into the fish stocks agreement, where we, for the first time, we talk about the interests of artisanal and subsistence fisheries while giving effect to their duty to cooperate. And finally, the code that you asked for, it's not a binding instrument, but you have a small-scale fisheries needing preferential access. Now, you might ask, what is the relevance to all of this in India? Now, when you talk about preferential access to fisheries resources, this was the demand of NFF, Worldwide Fishery Processing Finances, WFP, and that's why we have, through the struggle of the fisheries leaders and the community, the MFRAs in India, the Marine Fishing Regulation Acts, which first came as a model bill, and then we come up with the notion of reserving space in the sea, in your territorial sea, for the benefit of the smallest of the small. So you have these various I'll just go to that, but keep moving. Yeah. So this is just a chart. We'll be sending you all of this, so don't worry about taking this all in right now. That these, if you see, Kerala was one of the, which he called the leader in many negative aspects, but it was because of Thomas Kocheri and others being around, it was also a leader in positive aspect, which is that you have this protection, which is area reserved for traditional craft. In the Indian definition, traditional craft is one that doesn't use a motor for propulsion. And then area reserved for mechanized craft, but in mechanized you have motorized and then you have mechanized. You understand those?
I have a question. How is this applied? As in, this is like coast per coast, like.
Yeah. So the MFRA comes under the jurisdiction of the state government. So the Department of Fisheries, state government will only. So, for example, if the large-scale vessel is registered, like you saw in Goa today, technically, as per the law, Goa is mentioned here. The large guys, which you saw in the harbour today, shouldn't be fishing inside the 2 nautical mile zone or in the beyond 2 nautical miles. Actually, this is not a complete thing. I think it goes up to a few kilometers.
What does it say about artisanal fishing? So, who fish in the intertidal zone?
They can go anywhere. They can go anywhere. It depends on if you're.
No. As in the reservation of the space for fishing.
Yeah.
So, does that reservation also apply to the intertidal zones?
Intertidal zone is different from Marine Regulation Act.
That is why I am asking.
He is asking about the inland and intertidal zone. It is Marine Regulation Management Act is applicable from 0 to 12 nautical miles.